Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In chapter 3 and 4 of Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes is going to introduce and examine the notion of discourse in general, and he's going to distinguish between mental and verbal discourse, beginning with mental discourse. So we already have from the first two chapters sense, imagination, memory, experience, and understanding. Now it's a matter of taking what we get through and from those and putting those thoughts together. So he's going to begin by talking about mental discourse, which he calls the consequence or train of thoughts, the succession of one thought to another. And we distinguish this from discourse in words, right? Because it's taking place within our minds. Now, the word consequence, we tend to use that in a somewhat more restricted sense. He just means connection and following upon each other. And Hobbes thinks that a lot of this happens by way of sort of habit. We tend to associate certain things with each other. And, we can see what he says here, that, our imaginations are going to succeed each other over and over again. And so then eventually we come to go from one to the other. And then he's going to distinguish between two different ways in which our thoughts get connected with each other. One of these is unguided, and we could say, if we want to be a little facetious, more loosey-goosey, right? It doesn't have the strong connection. And why? Well, because it is without design, and he says it's inconstant. Why? When there's no passionate thought, as he's going to call it, to govern and direct those that follow to itself as the end and scope of some desire, some passion, then our thoughts are said to wander, and they seem, as he says, impertinent to each other. Now, impertinent not in the sense of being rude or presumptuous, but they're just not all that connected. So when we daydream, for example, when we let our minds wander, we are engaging in a train of thought. And actually, he says, if you were to look at it, you would find connections between these different thoughts. They're not totally random, dissociated from each other, but there's no overall guidance to them being provided by some sort of desire, passion, affect, some goal in mind. And then he says that the second is more constant. It's regulated by some desire and some design. So he gives us some examples. The impression made by things that we desire or fear is strong and permanent, or if it ceased for a time, of quick return. So strong it is to sometimes hinder and break our sleep. From desire arises the thought of some means we've seen to produce the like of that which we aim at. And from the thought of that, the thought of means to that mean, so continually till we come to some beginning within our own power. And because the end is coming to mind, the goal, the thing that's regulating it, our thoughts don't wander as much. They're focused, we could say. We pay attention to some things. So we've got two main ways in which we're putting thoughts together. And we're doing this all of the time, right? Because we're never not thinking or having imaginations, except perhaps when we're totally unconscious in sleep. But even with that, we may have dreams going on. And so then he's going to say, let's set aside the unguided for a moment, and let's just think about the regulated, more constant lines of thinking. Again, he's going to make a distinction. He says it's of two kinds. One is when we have an effect that is imagined, that is just in our mind, right? We seek the causes or the means that produce it. And this is interesting. He says this is common to human beings and other animals. And, we can think of all sorts of cool examples of this. The videos that we see of dogs and cats and other animals doing cool stuff. For example, the cat who saw people giving paper money to a hot dog guy or some other restaurateur and going and finding a leaf and bringing in the leaf and giving it to the guy and getting a little bit of food in response. This is exactly what Hobbes is talking about here. It wants let's say it's a hot dog, right? So the cat wants the hot dog, probably just the sausage part, doesn't care about the bun or the condiments, and it sees that the providing of something to the guy who's got the hot dog will result in the effect of I get a hot dog and I get to eat the hot dog, right? So it doesn't really understand paper money, but leaves look close enough, and the guy rewards it. The guy's like, oh, here you go, Mr. Cat, you get to have a hot dog. And now the cat shows up every day to get his little meal. And we do all sorts of stuff like this as well, right? The other that Hobbes says animals don't do, it's questionable whether some of them who show certain level of curiosity do or don't do this, seeking possible effects from something else. We imagine something and then we seek all the possible effects that by it can be produced. We imagine what we can do with it when we have it. And he says, I've only seen this in human beings. And, this is a curiosity hardly incident to the nature of any living creature that has no passion other than sensual, such as our hunger, thirst, lust, and anger. So because animals don't think on the level that we do, they don't think about the possible effects of something they have. We could get a hot dog and we could be like, oh, cool, I'll eat this. Or we could be like, maybe I should take a picture of this and post it on Instagram. That's a different use. Or we could be like, this hot dog would be perfect for propping up the loose table leg in this restaurant. Probably not a great use for it long term, but you get the idea. We have a certain flexibility. We're able to think of different possible effects from a cause. This is all mental discourse. This is all us kind of talking in our heads to ourselves. So then he's going to go on and he's going to talk about ways in which we do this. The discourse of the mind, when it's governed by design, is nothing but seeking, or the faculty of invention, which the Latins call sagacitas, and solertia, hunting out of causes, some effect, present or past, or of the effects of some present or past cause. So sometimes we look for what we've lost and we, run our mind over places, and sometimes we engage in remembrance, sometimes we know a place. We could sweep a room, for example. Sometimes we want to know the event of an action and we think of a similar action in the past. When I stuck my finger into the mousetrap, that hurt like hell. Maybe I shouldn't do that. That would be an example of this, right? You're following out a train of thought. He gives an example of seeing what will happen to a criminal. So you're tempted to do something you shouldn't. You look at what you've seen happen to criminals before. You think of the crime, the officer, the prison, the judge, and the gallows they're hung and killed, right? And we call this foresight and prudence or providence. And what actually gives us prudence? Hobbes says that it is experience. We need to actually have some, we could call it background, We need to have our mind stocked with examples of these past things. And so he says that although it may be called prudence when the event answers our expectation, in its own nature, it's just presumption, the foresight of things to come. Only God truly has that, but we can have more or less certainty by having experience. It's not going to give us perfect certainty, but pretty good. And here's where we start talking about signs. So he says a sign is the event antecedent of the consequence. So the thing that comes first and then what follows it, or the consequent of the antecedent when we've seen like consequences observed before, and the more often they have been observed, the less uncertain is the sign, this connection between before and after. So he says, he who has the most experience in any kind of business has the most signs, meaning they've accumulated in their memory or imagination the most instances that they can use to put things together. And they don't have to be completely certain to make good inferences about that. How many times have you drunk water in your life and found that it refreshed your thirst? Probably hundreds of thousands at this point if you're an adult like myself, maybe tens of thousands, who knows? That's experience, right? How many times have you fallen in love with somebody and tried to make a relationship out of it? Could be zero, could be quite a few, probably not going to be tens of thousands. So maybe you have less certainty about that sort of thing. So signs are quite important. And he's going to talk about different ways in which we use these. So the person who's prudent is really making a presumption of the future from experience of things past. I've seen how things work 30 times in the past. Sometimes they didn't work exactly like that, but most often it has worked like that. So I can use my experience to deduce what's going to happen, right? That's looking at the future. We can also similarly have a presumption of things past taken from other things past. And the example that Hobbes uses is really quite interesting here. So a little bit of background. Thomas Hobbes saw the English Civil War and actually wrote a companion piece to Leviathan called Behemoth, which is a historical work about why things fell apart in Great Britain, right? And so he has seen what is happening. He's actually trying to give us predictions about how not to do that sort of thing. So the example that he gives here, he says, he that has seen by which courses and degrees a flourishing state came first into civil war and then to ruin, upon the sight of the ruins of any other state, will guess the like war and the like courses have been there also. Right? And he says this is uncertain, right? Because it's grounded on experience. We could be wrong about this, but, you see somebody lying dead and there's blood dripping out of their head. You could be like, well, I'm willing to bet they had a head wound and that's what killed them, right? So you're not having to conjecture about a future thing. I mean, you could conjecture their body's going to rot, somebody will come along and report the crime. But you're looking at something that happened in the past and you're using the past to explain it. So this is what we do. This is what we human beings do because we carry out mental discourse in our minds. What happens after that? Well, when we get to chapter 4, which is titled Of Speech, he's really going to be talking about communication in general, so speech and writing. And he says that, the invention of printing is really ingenious, and that's a fairly recent development in Europe of his time. But he says, compare that to the invention of letters. Letters are amazing. Right? Even words are quite amazing. And he says that the most noble and profitable invention of all other was that of speech, consisting of names or appellations and their connection. And what is so great about this? This is how we register our thoughts and recall them when they're past and declare them to each other, without which we couldn't have any sort of society, he says. And he goes into, some biblical stuff. The first author's speech is God and talks to Adam. We don't have to worry too much about that. What we're really interested in is the fact that, as he says, the general use of speech is to transfer our mental discourse into a verbal, or the train of our thoughts into a train of words, and that for two, as he calls them, commodities, the useful things. So what are these two general functions of speech that we're going to use? Registering the consequences of our thought, which we might, forget about. So he calls this marks or notes of remembrance. We talk about things, we write them down, we make indexes of them. So that's very important, right? And then the other is signifying our thoughts and passions generally to other people. Many use the same words, he says, to signify by their connection and order, one to another, what they conceive or think of each matter, and also what they desire, fear, or have any other passion for. So those are general uses of speech. And then we have some special uses of speech as well, and he talks about 4 at this point. One of these is registering causes and effects, right? What we find to be the cause of anything present and past, and what we find things present or past may produce or affect. This is, as he says, acquiring arts. We can do the same thing over and over again fairly predictably. So that's really important. We also, as he's going to say, show to others knowledge we've attained. We counsel them and we teach them. Counseling is saying, well, in this sort of situation, you should do this. Teaching is saying, here's some information I'd like to impart to you so you're better off. The third thing, making our wills known. Using will in a very general sense, not just what we choose to do, but what we want, what it is we desire, what we don't desire, what we're averse to. And why? So that we can have mutual help of one another. If I say, oh man, I'm hungry. Is there anything to eat? I'm making my will known. I'm asking somebody, can you feed me, please? Right? And then 4th, pleasing and delighting ourselves and others. We play around with words, with language. We're not always on the job, so to speak. And so he says, to these uses, there's also 4 correspondent abuses. Sometimes when we're registering causes and effects, we get it wrong. And so he says we could get the words wrong, we might deceive ourselves. With counseling and teaching one another, Hobbes is not a fan of metaphor, even though he uses metaphors quite a bit. He says, when they use words metaphorically in other sense than they are ordained for, and they deceive others. Same thing can happen with our wills. We can deceive other people. We can say, I'm really hungry. I'm hungry for pancakes. And then they make the pancakes and we're like, ah ha ha, fooled you, jackass. I didn't want pancakes at all. Well, that's not making your will known. It's trying to deceive somebody about that. And then finally, this is very interesting, he says, we can grieve one another. So we have, other creatures that have weapons. We can use speech to grieve with the tongue. And, that would be an abuse of this. So we can use speech rightly. We can also use it wrongly. And speech and thought, or language and thought, are supposed to correspond to each other pretty closely for Hobbes. And this is kind of a typical modern approach to the connection between language and thought, or as he's going to call it, mental and verbal discourse.